In the sterile corridors of St. Mary's Medical Center, where life and death decisions happen in split seconds, everyone thought they knew Sarah Chen. To the doctors, she was just another nurse. Efficient, quiet, unremarkable.
To her patients, she was the gentle voice that calmed their fears. But when a critically wounded Navy SEAL arrived at their trauma bay, barely clinging to life, and whispered words that would shatter everything they believed about the woman in scrubs, the entire hospital would discover that sometimes the most extraordinary people hide in the most ordinary places. What they didn't know was that Sarah Chen had once been someone else entirely. Someone whose hands had saved lives in ways that would make their medical training look like child's play. Someone who had made a promise to never reveal who she truly was. Until tonight, when keeping that promise might mean watching a man die who knew her deepest secret. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as Sarah Chen adjusted her stethoscope around her neck for the third time that evening. Room 237 needed fresh bandages, Room 241 was asking for more pain medication, and Room 245 had a family member who wouldn't stop asking questions she couldn't answer. Just another typical Tuesday night at St. Mary's Medical Center in downtown Seattle. She moved through the hospital corridors with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this job for exactly 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Not that anyone was counting, least of all Sarah herself. To her colleagues, she was reliable but unremarkable. She showed up on time, did her job well, and went home to her small apartment where she lived alone with a cat named Whiskers, who had more personality than most of the people she worked with. Dr. Michael Harrison adjusted his surgical mask as he reviewed the patient chart on his tablet. At 42, he was the head of trauma surgery and had the ego to match his impressive credentials. His colleagues respected his skills, even if they didn't particularly like his attitude. Tonight, he was reviewing the case of Mrs. Patterson, a 78-year-old woman who had fallen down her basement stairs and fractured her hip. "Nurse Chen!" he called out without looking up from his tablet. "Mrs. Patterson in room 242 needs her pre-surgical medications. Make sure you explain the procedure to her family." Again, they seemed confused about the risks. Sarah nodded and made her way to room 242, where she found Mrs. Burdett, Patterson's daughter, crying quietly in the corner chair. The elderly woman herself was trying to comfort her daughter, despite being the one facing surgery in the morning. "Everything will be fine, sweetie," Mrs. Patterson was saying, her voice weak but steady. "The doctor knows what he's doing." Sarah knocked gently on the doorframe and entered with the medication tray. "Good evening, Mrs. Patterson. How are you feeling?" "Oh, I've been better, dear," the elderly woman replied, with a smile that reminded Sarah of her own grandmother. "But I'm not complaining. At my age, I'm grateful for every day I get." Sarah administered the medication and sat down beside the bed. This wasn't part of her official duties, but she had learned that sometimes the most important medicine she could provide wasn't something that came from a bottle. "Tell me about your family," Sarah said softly, noticing the photos that Mrs. Patterson's daughter had arranged on the bedside table. Mrs. Patterson's eyes lit up as she began describing her 4 grandchildren, their accomplishments in school, and their dreams for the future. Her daughter stopped crying and joined the conversation, sharing stories about her mother's strength and resilience throughout the years. 20 minutes later, both women were laughing about a story involving Mrs. Patterson's attempt to teach her grandson how to bake cookies, which had resulted in the fire department being called to their house last Christmas. "Thank you," Mrs. Patterson's daughter whispered to Sarah as she prepared to leave. She seemed so much calmer now. Sarah squeezed the woman's hand. "She's going to do great tomorrow. Dr. Harrison is an excellent surgeon." It was true. Despite his arrogance, Dr. Aleo Harrison was skilled at his job. Sarah had watched him perform countless procedures over the past 3 years, and she had never seen him make a mistake that mattered. His bedside manner needed work, but his hands were steady and precise. As Sarah left room 2042, she nearly collided with Jamie Rodriguez, one of the emergency room nurses who had become her closest friend at the hospital. Jamie was rushing down the hallway with an expression that Sarah recognized as controlled panic. "Sarah, thank God," Jamie said, catching her breath. "We need every available nurse in the ER right now. There's been an accident involving multiple vehicles on I-5, and we have several critical patients coming in." Sarah didn't hesitate. She had completed her assigned rounds for the evening, but in situations like this, everyone pitched in wherever they were needed most.
"What do we know about the casualties?" "At least 6 vehicles involved," Jamie explained as they hurried toward the elevator.
"We're expecting 8 patients, 3 of them critical. The paramedics are saying it looks like one of the cars lost control in the rain and caused a chain reaction. The elevator descended to the emergency room, and Sarah could already hear the controlled chaos that accompanied mass casualty events. Doctors and nurses were preparing trauma bays, wheeling in additional equipment, and coordinating with the ambulance crews who were still en route. Dr. Harrison was already in the ER, having been called down from the surgical floor. He was directing traffic with his usual authoritative manner, assigning staff members to different trauma bays and reviewing the incoming patient information that the paramedics were radioing ahead. "Chen," he called out when he saw her. "You're with me in Trauma Bay 3. We're getting a male, approximately 30 years old. Multiple injuries, including possible internal bleeding." Sarah nodded and began preparing the trauma bay, checking that all the necessary equipment was in place and functioning properly. She had assisted with trauma cases before, though nothing quite as complex as what they were expecting tonight. The first ambulance arrived 10 minutes later, carrying a woman in her 50s who had been driving alone when her car was struck from behind. She was conscious and complaining of chest pain, but her vital signs were stable. The second ambulance brought in a family of 4 from an SUV that had been hit on the passenger side. The children were frightened but appeared to have only minor injuries, while their parents would need more extensive treatment. The third ambulance was the one that carried the patient assigned to Trauma Bay 3.
The paramedics wheeled him in on a gurney, and Sarah got her first look at the man whose arrival would change everything she thought she knew about her carefully constructed new life.
He was indeed approximately 30 years old, with short brown hair and the kind of muscular build that suggested military training or serious athletic dedication.
His face was bruised and bloodied from the accident, but even unconscious, there was something about him that seemed familiar to Sarah, though she couldn't place where she might have seen him before. "What do we have, Dr. Conn?" Harrison asked the lead paramedic as they transferred the patient to the hospital bed. "John Stevens, age 29, driver of a motorcycle that was struck by one of the vehicles involved in the initial collision," the paramedic reported. "He was wearing a helmet, but he has multiple contusions, possible concussion, definitely some broken ribs, and we're concerned about internal bleeding. Blood pressure has been dropping during transport." Doctor. Harrison began his examination while Sarah assisted by monitoring the patient's vital signs and preparing the equipment he requested. She had worked with him enough times to anticipate his needs, handing him instruments before he asked for them, and adjusting the patient's position to give him better access for his examination. "Get me a CT scan of his abdomen and chest," Dr. Harrison ordered. "And I want a full blood panel. Sarah, check his wallet for emergency contact information." Sarah retrieved the patient's wallet from the plastic bag containing his personal effects. Inside, she found a Washington state driver's license confirming his identity as John Stevens, along with what appeared to be a military ID card. She looked more closely at the military ID and felt her breath catch in her throat. The ID identified John Stevens as a petty officer first class in the United States Navy, assigned to Naval Special Warfare Group 1. In simpler terms, he was a Navy SEAL. Sarah's hands began to tremble slightly as she held the ID card. She forced herself to remain calm and professional, but memories that she had spent 3 years trying to suppress began flooding back into her consciousness. Memories of sand and heat and the sound of helicopters. Memories of other men and women in uniform who had trusted her with their lives. Memories of the person she used to be before she became Sarah Chen, the unremarkable nurse at St. Mary's Medical Center. "Any emergency contacts?" "Dr. Pry," Harrison asked without looking up from his examination. Sarah checked the wallet more thoroughly and found a card listing a woman named Rebecca Stevens as his emergency contact, presumably his wife or sister. There was also a phone number for what appeared to be his commanding officer. "Yes," she managed to say, her voice steady despite the emotional storm brewing inside her. "I'll call them now." But as she turned to leave the trauma bay to make the phone calls, the patient's eyes suddenly opened. He was disoriented and obviously in pain, but his gaze found Sarah's face and his expression changed from confusion to something that looked like recognition. "Phoenix," he whispered, so quietly that only Sarah could hear him. The word hit her like a physical blow. Phoenix had been her call sign, the name that the special operations teams had known her by during her previous life. The name that was supposed to be buried forever along with everything else she had left behind. Sarah's professional composure nearly cracked, but she managed to maintain her expression of concerned detachment. "You're in the hospital," she told John Stevens in the calm, reassuring voice she used with all her patients. "You've been in an accident, but you're going to be okay." John's eyes remained fixed on her face, and she could see him struggling to stay conscious. "Phoenix," he repeated, slightly louder this time. "It's really you." "Doctor!" Harrison looked up from the chart he was reviewing. What did he say? Sarah's mind raced. If John Stevens revealed her true identity here and now, everything she had built over the past 3 years would come crashing down. The quiet life she had constructed, the peace she had found in anonymity, the safety she had created by disappearing completely from her former world. All of it would be gone. "He's disoriented from the head injury," she said quickly. "He thinks I'm someone he knows." "Doctor." Harrison nodded, accepting her explanation without question. Head injuries often cause confusion and disorientation, and it wasn't uncommon for patients to mistake hospital staff for people from their past. But John Stevens wasn't confused, and Sarah knew it. Despite his injuries, his eyes were clear and focused, and the way he was looking at her made it obvious that he knew exactly who she was and what she had once been. "You disappeared," he whispered, his voice growing weaker as the pain medication began to take effect. "Everyone wondered what happened to you." Sarah leaned closer to his bed, pretending to check his pulse while actually positioning herself so that she could speak to him without being overheard.
You don't know me,
she said quietly but firmly. "Whatever you think you remember, you're wrong." But even as she said the words, she knew they wouldn't be enough. John Stevens had recognized her, and no amount of denial on her part was going to change that fact. The question now was whether he would respect her obvious desire to remain anonymous, or whether her carefully guarded secret was about to be exposed to everyone in the trauma bay. The CT scan results came back showing internal bleeding that would require immediate surgery. Dr. Harrison ordered John to be prepared for the operating room, and Sarah found herself assigned to assist with the pre-surgical preparations. As they worked to stabilize him for surgery, John drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time he opened his eyes, his gaze sought out Sarah's face, and she could see the questions he wanted to ask. Questions about why she had disappeared, where she had been, and what she was doing working as a hospital nurse instead of saving lives in war zones around the world. Questions that she couldn't answer without revealing truths that she had sworn to take to her grave. The anesthesiologist arrived to begin preparing John for surgery, and Sarah knew that this might be her last chance to speak with him before he went under. She waited until the other medical staff were occupied with their preparations, then leaned close to his ear. "Please," she whispered, "don't say anything about who you think I am. I can't explain why, but I need you to promise me that you won't tell anyone." John's eyes opened and focused on her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Even injured and sedated, there was something about Navy SEALs that commanded attention and respect. They were trained to notice details that other people missed, to remember faces and voices and conversations that might prove important later. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Sarah glanced around to make sure they weren't being observed, then met his gaze directly. "Because the person you think you know doesn't exist anymore. She died 3 years ago, and everyone is safer that way." John studied her face for a long moment, and Sarah could see him processing her words and the implications behind them. Whatever had happened to make her disappear from her former life, whatever had driven her to create an entirely new identity and hide in plain sight as a hospital nurse, he seemed to understand that it was serious enough to warrant his silence. "Okay," he said finally, "but this isn't over." Before Sarah could ask what he meant by that, the anesthesiologist began administering the medication that would render John unconscious for surgery. Within seconds, his eyes closed, and his body relaxed as he slipped into the artificial sleep that would allow Dr. Harrison to repair the damage caused by the motorcycle accident. Sarah watched the monitors displaying John's vital signs and tried to convince herself that his promise to keep her secret would be enough to protect the new life she had built. But deep down, she knew that John Stevens' arrival at St. Mary's Medical Center marked the end of her anonymity. The question that remained was whether that ending would bring freedom or disaster, and Sarah honestly didn't know which possibility frightened her more. The surgery lasted 4 hours and 37 minutes. Sarah knew this because she had been watching the clock on the wall of the surgical waiting area, counting every minute that passed while Dr. Falls. Harrison worked to repair John Stevens' internal injuries. She had volunteered to stay late and monitor his recovery, telling herself it was just professional concern for a patient who had suffered significant trauma. She wasn't fooling anyone, least of all herself. When Dr. Harrison finally emerged from the operating room, still wearing his surgical scrubs. Sarah could tell from his expression that the procedure had been successful. His ego might be insufferable at times, but she had never questioned his skills as a surgeon. "The bleeding has been stopped and we've repaired the damaged spleen," He reported to the small group of medical staff who had been waiting for updates. He's stable now, but he'll need close monitoring for the next 24 hours. There was more internal damage than we initially expected. Sarah felt a wave of relief that surprised her with its intensity. She barely knew John Stevens, and their brief interaction in the trauma bay had created more complications in her life than solutions. But the thought of him dying on the operating table had filled her with a dread that went beyond normal professional concern. "I'll take the first monitoring shift," she volunteered, earning a surprised look from Jamie Rodriguez, who had been planning to head home after her regular shift ended. "Are you sure?" Jamie asked. "You've already been here for 12 hours today." "I don't mind," Sarah replied, which was both true and completely inadequate as an explanation for why she felt compelled to personally oversee John Stevens' recovery. Dr. Harrison nodded his approval. "Good. He'll be in the ICU until we're certain there are no complications. Monitor his blood pressure, heart rate, and oxygen levels. Call me immediately if there are any changes." 2 hours later, Sarah was sitting beside John's bed in the intensive care unit, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest and listening to the rhythmic beeping of the monitors that tracked his vital signs. The ICU was quieter than the regular hospital floors, with dimmed lighting and a sense of controlled vigilance that she found oddly comforting. John was still unconscious from the anesthesia, but the color had returned to his face and his vital signs were strong and steady. The surgery had been successful, and barring any unexpected complications, he would make a full recovery. Sarah found herself studying his face more closely than she probably should have. Without the bruises and blood from the accident, she could see the resemblance to other special operations soldiers she had known in her previous life. They all seemed to share certain characteristics, the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing they could handle whatever challenges life threw at them, and the subtle signs of physical conditioning that marked them as warriors, even when they were sleeping peacefully in hospital beds. She was so absorbed in her observations that she didn't notice when John's eyes opened and focused on her face. "How long have I been out?" he asked, his voice hoarse but alert. Sarah checked her watch. "About 6 hours since you went into surgery. How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck," John replied with a weak smile. "But I've felt worse." Everything looked normal, which was a relief. The surgery went well. Dr. Harrison was able to repair all the internal damage. John nodded, then winced slightly as the movement caused pain in his chest where his ribs had been fractured. "Good. When can I get out of here?" "You'll be here for at least a few days," Sarah told him. "Internal injuries require careful monitoring, especially when surgery is involved." "A few days," John repeated, and Sarah could see him processing what that meant. A few days of being in the same hospital where she worked, a few days of opportunities for conversations that she definitely didn't want to have. They sat in silence for several minutes, with Sarah pretending to review his chart while John watched her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Finally, she couldn't avoid the conversation any longer. "What you said in the emergency room," she began carefully. "About thinking you knew me, head injuries can cause confusion and false memories. It's more common than you might think." John's expression didn't change. "My head is fine." "The CT scan showed evidence of a concussion," Sarah countered. "The CT scan showed bruising that doesn't affect my memory," John replied. "I know who you are, Phoenix. The question is why you're pretending to be someone else." Sarah felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Dr. Fifth. Eleanor Vasquez," John said quietly. "Combat medic with the 75th Ranger Regiment before you transferred to Special Operations Support. You saved my life in Afghanistan 3 years ago when our convoy hit an IED outside Kandahar." The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. Dr. Elena Vasquez was who she used to be, the person she had been before she became Sarah Chen. Hearing her real name spoken aloud after 3 years of hiding behind a false identity was both terrifying and strangely liberating. "That person doesn't exist anymore," Sarah said, echoing the words she had spoken to him before his surgery. "Why?" John asked. "What happened?" Sarah glanced around the ICU to make sure they weren't being overheard, then moved her chair closer to his bed. If they were going to have this conversation, she needed to make sure it remained private, because Dr. Elena Vasquez saw things and learned things that made her dangerous to people who prefer to operate in the shadows, she said quietly. And when she tried to do the right thing about what she had learned, those people made it clear that her continued existence was not in their best interests. John's expression grew serious. As a Navy SEAL, he understood the world of classified operations and the kinds of moral compromises that were sometimes required to complete missions. He also understood that people who crossed certain lines or learned certain secrets didn't always get to walk away from their old lives intact. What kind of things? He asked. Sarah hesitated. She had spent 3 years avoiding this conversation, 3 years telling herself that the past was buried and that she could build a new life without ever having to explain what had driven her into hiding. But sitting here in the ICU, looking into the eyes of someone who had known her as Dr. Elena Vasquez, she found herself wanting to tell the truth to someone who might actually understand. "Have you ever heard of Operation Nightfall?" she asked. John shook his head, but Sarah could see recognition in his eyes. Military personnel at his level were often aware of classified operations even if they weren't directly involved in them. "It was a joint special operations mission in Syria," Sarah continued. "Officially, it never happened. Unofficially, it was designed to eliminate a high-value target who was coordinating attacks against American forces throughout the region." "What was your role?" John asked. "Medical support," Sarah replied. "I was there to treat any casualties among our team members and to provide emergency care if we encountered wounded civilians during the operation." Sarah paused, remembering the heat and dust of that night, the weight of her medical kit on her shoulders, and the sound of helicopters approaching the compound where their target was supposed to be hiding. "The intelligence was wrong," she said finally. "The compound wasn't a terrorist stronghold. It was a refugee camp housing families who had fled from other parts of the country." John's expression grew grim. He had been involved in enough operations to know that intelligence failures were not uncommon, and that sometimes those failures resulted in civilian casualties that were then classified and hidden from public scrutiny. "How many?" he asked. 43, Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Including 16 children." The numbers hung in the air between them like an accusation. 43 innocent people who had died because someone had provided false intelligence, or because someone had decided that the risk of civilian casualties was acceptable as long as the mission was completed successfully. "What did you do?" John asked. "What I was trained to do," Sarah said. "I treated the wounded. I tried to save as many lives as possible. But there weren't many survivors, and most of them didn't make it through the night." Sarah remembered working frantically in the dust and smoke, moving from victim to victim, trying to stop bleeding and stabilize injuries that were too severe for the limited medical supplies she carried. She remembered the face of a little girl, maybe 6 years old, who had looked up at her with trusting eyes even as her life slipped away. "When we returned to base, I was told that the operation had been a complete success," Sarah continued. "The official report stated that we had eliminated a terrorist cell and that there had been no civilian casualties. I was ordered to sign a statement confirming that version of events." "But you refused," John said. "It wasn't a question." "I refused," Sarah confirmed. "I told them that I wouldn't participate in covering up what had really happened. I said that the families of those 43 people deserved to know the truth about how they had died." John nodded slowly. He could imagine how that conversation had gone, and he could understand why it had ended with Dr. Elena Vasquez disappearing completely from her old life. "They gave you a choice," he said. "Sign the false report and accept a transfer to a new assignment where I would be carefully monitored, or face charges for insubordination and potentially treason." Sarah replied. "But I knew that even if I signed the report, I would never be safe. I had seen too much, and I knew too much. Eventually, they would decide that I was too much of a risk to leave alive. So you disappeared," John said. "Elena Vasquez died in a car accident 6 months after returning from that deployment," Sarah said. "At least, that's what her death certificate says." Sarah Chen was born a few weeks later, complete with a nursing degree from a community college and a clean background check. John studied her face, and Sarah could see him trying to reconcile the woman sitting beside his hospital bed with the combat medic who had saved his life in Afghanistan. The two identities seemed completely different on the surface, but he could see the connections now. The steady hands, the calm competence under pressure, the way she moved through the hospital with quiet confidence. "How did you manage to create a new identity?" he asked. "I had help," Sarah replied, but she didn't elaborate. Some secrets were too dangerous to share, even with someone who already knew her biggest secret. They sat in silence for several minutes, both of them processing the weight of what had been revealed. Sarah felt simultaneously relieved and terrified to have finally told someone the truth about her past. John was trying to understand how the woman who had fearlessly treated wounded soldiers in combat zones had ended up hiding behind a false identity as a hospital nurse. "Do you regret it?" John asked finally. "Giving up your old life?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I regret what happened to those 43 people," she said. I regret not being able to give their families the truth they deserved. I regret not being able to continue serving soldiers who needed medical care in dangerous places. But I don't regret refusing to participate in a cover-up. Even though it cost you everything? John asked. Even though it cost me everything, Sarah confirmed. John nodded, and Sarah could see respect in his expression. As a member of the Special Operations community, he understood the courage it had taken for her to stand up to powerful people who preferred their mistakes to remain hidden. Your secret is safe with me, he said. I won't tell anyone who you really are. Sarah felt a wave of gratitude that threatened to bring tears to her eyes. Thank you. But I have a question, John continued.
What? Are you happy? He asked.
Living this quiet life, taking care of patients who will never know what you sacrificed for your principles.
Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering his question.
Was she happy? She had found peace in her work at St. Mary's, and she genuinely cared about the patients she treated. But there were nights when she lay awake thinking about the soldiers who might have benefited from her skills, the lives she might have saved if she had been able to continue serving in special operations medical support. I'm alive, she said finally. 3 years ago, that wasn't guaranteed. John seemed to understand the weight behind that simple statement. Being alive when powerful enemies wanted you dead was its own form of victory, even if it came at the cost of the life you had originally planned to live. Elena, he said, using her real name for the first time since his surgery. Sarah, she corrected gently. Alina died 3 years ago, remember? Sarah, John repeated. Thank you. For saving my life in Afghanistan and for taking care of me tonight. Thank you for keeping my secret, Sarah replied. But even as she said the words, Sarah knew that John Stevens' presence in her hospital had changed everything. Her carefully constructed anonymity had been shattered, and there was no going back to the simple life she had built as Sarah Chen, the unremarkable nurse. The question now was what would come next, and whether she was ready to face whatever consequences might follow from having her true identity exposed, even to someone who promised to keep her secret. As if reading her thoughts, John spoke again. You know this doesn't end here, right? What do you mean? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. There are people who have been looking for Dr. Elena Vasquez for 3 years, John said. People who want to make sure that what she knows never becomes public knowledge. If they find out she's alive and working at this hospital, your quiet life is going to end very quickly. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had always known that discovery was a possibility, but she had convinced herself that after 3 years of successfully hiding, she was safe. John's words reminded her that safety was an illusion when you possessed information that powerful people wanted to keep buried. What do you suggest I do? She asked. John was quiet for a moment, considering her options. You could disappear again, he said finally, create another new identity and start over somewhere else. Or? Sarah asked, sensing there was another possibility he was considering. Or you could stop running, John said. Stop hiding. Find a way to make the truth public so that those people can't threaten you anymore. Sarah stared at him in disbelief. You're suggesting I should expose Operation Nightfall? Tell the world what really happened. I'm suggesting you should consider it, John replied. You're a doctor, Sarah. You took an oath to do no harm. How much harm is being done by allowing those 43 deaths to remain hidden? How many other operations like Nightfall have happened since then because there were no consequences for what went wrong? His words hit her like a physical blow because they echoed thoughts that had haunted her for 3 years. She had saved her own life by running and hiding, but she had also allowed the people responsible for those deaths to escape accountability for their actions. It's been 3 years, Sarah said. Even if I wanted to expose what happened, who would believe me? And what proof do I have beyond my own testimony? More proof than you think, John replied, and more allies than you realize. What do you mean? Sarah asked. But before John could answer, they heard footsteps approaching the ICU. Dr. Harrison appeared in the doorway, followed by a woman in her 30s with brown hair and worried eyes. Mr. Stevens, doctor, Harrison said, your wife is here to see you. Sarah's heart sank as she realized that John's promise to keep her secret was about to be tested much sooner than either of them had expected. The woman who entered the ICU was not what Sarah had expected. Rebecca Stevens moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to handling crisis situations, and her eyes held the kind of sharp intelligence that suggested she was much more than just a worried spouse. She wore jeans and a leather jacket, and Sarah noticed that her boots looked like they were designed for function rather than fashion. "How is he?" Rebecca asked. "Dr. Virgil." Harrison, her voice steady despite the concern in her eyes. "The surgery was successful." "Dr." Harrison replied in his professional tone. "We repaired the internal bleeding, and he's recovering well. He should be able to go home in a few days if there are no complications." Rebecca's gaze moved to Sarah, who was still sitting beside John's bed. "And you are?" "Sarah Chen," Sarah replied, standing and extending her hand. "I'm one of the nurses assigned to your husband's care." Rebecca's handshake was firm and her eyes were assessing, as if she were automatically cataloguing details about Sarah's appearance and demeanor. Sarah had the uncomfortable feeling that she was being evaluated by someone with professional training in observation and analysis. "Thank you for taking care of him," Rebecca said, but there was something in her tone that suggested she was waiting for more information.
John had been watching this interaction carefully, and Sarah could see him making some kind of decision behind his eyes. When he spoke, his words were carefully chosen.
"Becca," he said, using what was obviously a pet name. "This is the nurse I was telling you about, the one who was so professional during the emergency." It was a simple statement, but Sarah caught the subtle emphasis on certain words. John was communicating something to his wife, something that required her to understand a message that wasn't being spoken directly. Rebecca's expression sharpened slightly, and Sarah realized that she had just received some kind of coded information. "I see," Rebecca said, her tone neutral but her eyes more alert than before. "Dr. Harrison," John said, "would it be possible for me to have a few minutes alone with my wife? I'd like to discuss some personal matters with her." Dr. Harrison nodded. "Of course. Nurse Chen and I will be just outside if you need anything." Sarah followed Dr. Pulling Harrison out of the ICU room, but she found herself straining to hear the conversation that was taking place behind the closed door. She couldn't make out the specific words, but she could hear the urgent tone of whispered voices, engaged in what sounded like a serious discussion. "He seems to be recovering remarkably well," Dr. Harrison observed as they stood in the hallway. "SEAL training must include some excellent conditioning for handling physical trauma." "SEAL training?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. "According to his military ID, he's with Naval Special Warfare," Dr. Harrison replied. "Elite soldiers. They're trained to function under extreme physical and mental stress." Sarah nodded, processing this confirmation of John's background. She had suspected he was special operations, based on his physical condition and bearing, but hearing it confirmed made her even more nervous about what he might be telling his wife behind that closed door. 10 minutes later, the door opened and Rebecca emerged with John. She walked directly to Sarah with a purposeful stride that made Sarah's pulse quicken. "Nurse Chen," Rebecca said, "could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Sarah glanced at Dr. Harrison, who waved them away with a distracted gesture as he reviewed John's chart. "Of course," Sarah replied, though she was dreading whatever conversation was about to take place. Rebecca led her to a small consultation room down the hallway from the ICU. Once they were inside with the door closed, Rebecca's entire demeanor changed. The worried wife persona disappeared, replaced by someone who was clearly accustomed to handling sensitive situations. "John tells me that you two have met before," Rebecca said without preamble. Sarah felt her heart racing. "I think there's been some confusion. Head injuries can cause patients to think they recognize people when—" "Dr. Elena Vasquez," Rebecca interrupted quietly. "Afghanistan 2023. Operation Redbird, when John's convoy hit an IED outside Kandahar." The use of her real name and specific details about the incident made it impossible for Sarah to continue denying her identity. Rebecca Stevens knew exactly who she was, which meant that John had shared information that could destroy the new life she had spent 3 years building. "He promised he wouldn't tell anyone," Sarah said, feeling a mixture of betrayal and panic. "He didn't have a choice," Rebecca replied. "Because I'm not just his wife. I'm also CIA, and I've been looking for Dr. Marcu, Elena Vasquez, for the past 18 months. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. The Central Intelligence Agency had been looking for her, which meant that her carefully maintained anonymity had been an illusion. If the CIA had been searching for her, it was only a matter of time before other, less friendly organizations learned about her location. "Why?" Sarah managed to ask. "Because 18 months ago, a whistleblower leaked classified documents about Operation Nightfall to a journalist," Rebecca said. "The leak included details about civilian casualties that matched your medical reports from that mission." Sarah's mind raced as she processed this information. Someone had exposed the truth about what had happened during Operation Nightfall, which meant that her refusal to sign the false report had been vindicated, but it also meant that she was now connected to a major intelligence leak, which made her a target for people who were much more dangerous than the military officials who had originally threatened her. Who was the whistleblower? Sarah asked. We don't know, Rebecca replied. But the leaked documents suggested that there was a combat medic who had witnessed the entire incident and refused to participate in the cover-up. The documents included references to medical reports that could only have been written by someone with your level of training and experience. So you've been hunting me down to arrest me for treason? Sarah asked. No, Rebecca said, surprising her. I've been trying to find you to offer you protection. Sarah stared at her in confusion. Protection from what? From the people who have been trying to kill you for the past 3 years, Rebecca replied matter-of-factly. The same people who killed Major Williams, Captain Rodriguez, and Staff Sergeant Johnson. The names hit Sarah like physical blows. She knew all 3 of those people. They had been part of the Operation Nightfall team, and each of them had expressed concerns about the official version of events that had been included in the mission report. They're dead? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Car accidents, home invasions, training accidents, Rebecca said grimly. All within 6 months of each other. All after the Operation Nightfall documents were leaked. Too many coincidences for anyone to believe they were actually accidents. Sarah felt sick to her stomach. 3 good soldiers had died because they had possessed knowledge that someone wanted to keep buried. If she hadn't disappeared when she did, she would probably have suffered the same fate. Why are you telling me this? Sarah asked. Because the leaked documents have created an opportunity, Rebecca replied. For the first time in 3 years, we have a chance to expose what really happened during Operation Nightfall and hold the people responsible accountable for their actions. We? Sarah asked. There are people within the intelligence community who believe that Operation Nightfall was a war crime that has been covered up by officials who should face prosecution, Rebecca explained. The leaked documents provided some evidence, but not enough to build a case that would hold up in court. What kind of evidence would you need? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Testimony from someone who was actually present during the operation, Rebecca said. Someone with medical training who could provide expert analysis of the injuries sustained by the civilian casualties. Someone who refused to participate in the cover-up and whose integrity couldn't be questioned. Sarah understood now why the CIA had been looking for her. They needed her testimony to build a case against the people responsible for Operation Nightfall, and they were offering protection in exchange for her cooperation. What kind of protection? Sarah asked. Full witness protection, Rebecca replied. New identity, relocation to a secure location, financial support for as long as necessary. In exchange, you would testify before a congressional oversight committee about what you witnessed during Operation Nightfall. Sarah was quiet for several minutes, weighing her options. The life she had built as Sarah Chen was comfortable and safe, but it was also based on lies and constant fear of discovery. The opportunity to finally tell the truth about what had happened during Operation Nightfall was tempting, but it would mean giving up the anonymity that had kept her alive for 3 years. What happens if I refuse? Sarah asked. You continue living as Sarah Chen, hoping that the people who killed Major Williams and the others never figure out where you are, Rebecca replied. But now that John has recognized you, your location has been compromised. It's only a matter of time before word gets out that Dr. Elena Vasquez is alive and working at St. Mary's Medical Center. Sarah realized that Rebecca was right. Even if John kept her secret, too many people now knew about her true identity. Hospital staff who had overheard John calling her by the wrong name, security cameras that had recorded their interactions, digital records that could be analyzed by people with the right resources and motivation. How much time do I have to decide? Sarah asked. Not much, Rebecca replied honestly. We've already intercepted communications suggesting that certain parties are planning to take action against potential witnesses in the Operation Nightfall case. If you're going to accept our protection, we need to move you to a secure location within the next 48 hours. Sarah felt the walls of her carefully constructed new life closing in around her. 3 years of peace and anonymity were about to end, one way or another. The only question was whether she would face whatever came next as a victim or as someone who had chosen to fight back. I need time to think, Sarah said. You have until tomorrow night, Rebecca replied. After that, we can't guarantee your safety. Rebecca handed her a business card with only a phone number printed on it. Call me when you've made your decision. And Sarah, don't go home tonight. Find somewhere else to stay, somewhere that wouldn't be obvious to people who might be watching your apartment. With that ominous warning, Rebecca left Sarah alone in the consultation room with her thoughts and the weight of a decision that would determine the rest of her life. Sarah returned to the ICU to find John sitting up in bed, looking more alert than he had since arriving at the hospital. His color was good and his vital signs were stable, which meant that he was recovering from his injuries faster than she had expected. "How much of that conversation did you hear?" she asked. "Enough to know that you're in serious danger," John replied. Becca filled me in on the details about the other witnesses who were killed. Sarah sat down in the chair beside his bed, feeling emotionally exhausted. "I thought I was safe. 3 years of living quietly, of not causing any trouble, of just being a normal person with a normal job. You were never going to be safe as long as the truth about Operation Nightfall remained hidden," John said gently. "Too many people died that night, and too many people have been killed since then to keep it quiet. But if I testify, I'll be putting myself in even more danger," Sarah pointed out. "Maybe," John admitted. "But you'll also be putting the people responsible for those deaths in danger of facing justice, and you'll be honoring the memory of Major Williams, Captain Rodriguez, and Staff Sergeant Johnson by making sure their deaths weren't in vain." Sarah knew he was right, but that didn't make the decision any easier. Testifying against powerful people who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill witnesses would require a level of courage that she wasn't sure she possessed. "There's something else," John said, interrupting her thoughts. "What?" "Becca didn't tell you everything about why the CIA has been looking for you," John said. "She didn't want to pressure you into making a decision based on guilt." "What are you talking about?" Sarah asked. "The leaked documents about Operation Nightfall weren't just about seeking justice for what happened 3 years ago," John explained. "They were also about preventing something that's being planned for the future." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of something?" "Another operation," John said grimly. "Something called Operation Blackout. Based on the intelligence that's been gathered, it's going to be similar to Nightfall, but much larger in scope." "How much larger?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Instead of 43 civilian casualties, they're projecting several hundred," John replied. "Maybe more, depending on how the situation develops." Sarah felt sick. The thought that the people responsible for the deaths during Operation Nightfall were planning an even larger atrocity was almost too horrifying to contemplate. "When?" she asked. "Soon," John said. "Maybe within the next few weeks." Sarah stared at him in shock. If she chose to remain silent and continue hiding as Sarah Chen, she would be allowing hundreds of innocent people to die in an operation that could potentially be prevented if she had the courage to speak out. "Now do you understand why Becca has been so desperate to find you?" John asked. "Your testimony isn't just about seeking justice for what happened in the past. It's about preventing a much larger tragedy from happening in the future." Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a crushing burden. The decision she had thought was about her own safety and future had suddenly become about the lives of hundreds of people she had never met, but who would die if she didn't find the courage to act.
"I need some air," Sarah said, standing abruptly.
"Sarah," John called after her as she headed toward the door.
"What?"
"Whatever you decide, I want you to know that I respect you," he said, "for what you did 3 years ago and for whatever you choose to do now." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and left the ICU. She walked through the hospital corridors aimlessly, trying to process everything that had been revealed in the past few hours. Her quiet life as Sarah Chen was over, but what would replace it was still unclear. As she passed the windows overlooking the hospital parking garage, Sarah noticed a black SUV with tinted windows that hadn't been there earlier in the evening. 2 men in dark suits were standing beside it, and both of them seemed to be watching the hospital entrance. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized that her time for making a decision might have just run out. The people who had killed 3 members of the Operation Nightfall team had found her, and they were no longer content to wait for her to accidentally reveal herself. The hunt that had begun 3 years ago was about to reach its conclusion, one way or another. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone and dialed the number Rebecca had given her. The black SUV was still in the parking garage, and she could see the 2 men were now talking into what appeared to be communication devices. They had found her, and time was running out. "Rebecca Stevens," came the crisp response after just 1 ring. "It's Sarah," she whispered, moving away from the window. "They're here, at the hospital." "How many?" Rebecca asked, her voice immediately shifting to a professional tone. "2 that I can see, but there could be more," Sarah replied. Black SUV in the parking garage, level 3.
Stay exactly where you are, Rebecca ordered.
Don't go back to John's room. Don't go to your car. Don't leave the building. We have assets in the area who can respond, but it's going to take 15 minutes. 15 minutes? Sarah repeated, feeling panic rising in her chest. They could be inside the building in 5. Then you need to find somewhere to hide for 15 minutes, Rebecca said. Somewhere with multiple exit routes and security cameras. These people won't want to create a scene in a public place with witnesses and recordings. Sarah looked around the hospital corridor, trying to think of the safest location. The emergency room would have the most security cameras and the most people, but it was also on the ground floor where the 2 men could easily access it. The surgical floors would be quieter, but might offer more places to hide. The ICU, Sarah realized. It is restricted access, security cameras, and multiple exits. Plus, John is there. John can't help you in his current condition, Rebecca warned. But you're right about the security features. Get to the ICU and stay there until my people arrive. Sarah ended the call and hurried back toward the intensive care unit, trying to look casual while her heart pounded with fear. She passed several other hospital staff members in the corridors, and she forced herself to nod and smile normally rather than running in obvious panic. As she approached the ICU, she saw Dr. Harrison emerging from one of the patient rooms. He looked surprised to see her returning so soon. "Is everything all right, Nurse Chen?" he asked. "You look pale." Sarah realized that this might be her last opportunity to speak with someone who had become a colleague over the past 3 years. Despite his arrogance, Dr. Harrison was a good surgeon and a decent person, and she felt she owed him some explanation for the chaos that was about to descend on his hospital. "Dr. Harrison," she said, "I need to tell you something important." "What is it?" he asked, his expression becoming more serious. Sarah glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard, then spoke quickly. "My real name isn't Sarah Chen. It's Dr. Elena Vasquez, and there are people who want to kill me because of something I witnessed during military service. They're in the hospital right now, and the situation is about to become very dangerous." Harrison stared at her in shock. "What are you talking about?" "I don't have time to explain everything," Sarah said urgently. "But you need to alert hospital security and consider implementing lockdown procedures. The people looking for me are professionals, and they won't hesitate to hurt innocent bystanders if it helps them accomplish their mission." Before Dr. Harrison could respond, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of elevator doors opening at the far end of the corridor. She turned to see 2 men in dark suits stepping out of the elevator, and her blood ran cold when she recognized them as the same men she had seen in the parking garage. "Those are the men," she whispered to Dr. Belfast. "Harrison, call security now." Sarah hurried into the ICU, hoping that the restricted access would slow down her pursuers long enough for help to arrive. She found John sitting up in bed, fully alert and obviously expecting trouble. "Becca called," he said without preamble. "She told me what's happening." "They're in the building," Sarah replied, moving to the window to see if there were more vehicles in the parking garage. 2 men, maybe more. John was already reaching for the emergency call button beside his bed. "We need to get hospital security up here immediately." "Dr. Harrison is handling that," Sarah said, but even as she spoke, she realized that hospital security guards were unlikely to be equipped to handle professional killers who were willing to operate inside a medical facility. "Where are Becca's people?" John asked. 15 minutes out, Sarah replied. John checked the clock on the wall. "We need to buy time." Sarah heard voices in the corridor outside the ICU. "Dr. Pidd." Harrison speaking in urgent tones to someone who was responding with calm, professional questions. Then she heard footsteps approaching the ICU entrance. "Dr. Chen?" a voice called out. "We're with the State Department. We need to speak with you about a sensitive matter." Sarah and John exchanged glances. The men were claiming to be government officials, which would give them credibility with hospital staff and potentially access to areas that would normally be restricted. "They're lying," Sarah whispered. "The State Department wouldn't send armed men to a hospital." "How do you know they're armed?" John asked. "Because that's how these people operate," Sarah replied. "They come prepared for resistance." The voice called out again, closer to the ICU entrance. "Dr. Plameso, President, Dr. Chen, we know you're here. We have documentation authorizing us to speak with you. This can be resolved peacefully if you cooperate." Sarah could hear Dr. Harrison's voice responding, though she couldn't make out his specific words. He sounded confused and concerned, which was exactly what she would expect from someone trying to process the sudden appearance of federal agents in his hospital. Sarah, John said quietly, there's something you need to know about my wife.
What?
Sarah asked, though she was focused on listening to the conversation in the corridor. She's not just CIA, John said.
She's part of a special unit that handles situations exactly like this one. When she says help is 15 minutes out, she means military-trained personnel with the authorization and equipment to handle professional killers.
Sarah looked at him with surprise. Military personnel, Joint Special Operations Command, John confirmed. The same people who would normally handle terrorist threats on American soil. Before Sarah could ask more questions, she heard new voices in the corridor. Someone was giving crisp orders in a tone that suggested military training, and she could hear the sound of multiple footsteps moving with coordinated precision.
Federal agents, a new voice announced, much louder and more authoritative than the previous speakers.
This area is now under federal jurisdiction. All civilian personnel need to evacuate immediately. Sarah heard Dr. Harrison's confused protest, followed by someone explaining that there was a credible terrorist threat in the hospital and that all non-essential personnel needed to be moved to a secure location. That's Becker's people, John said with obvious relief. But their relief was short-lived. Sarah heard the distinctive sound of breaking glass, followed by shouts and what sounded like furniture being overturned. The two men claiming to be State Department officials were not going quietly. "Gun!" someone shouted in the corridor, followed by the sound of running feet and urgent radio communications. Sarah and John both dropped to the floor as the situation in the corridor escalated into what sounded like an armed confrontation. Sarah could hear professional voices coordinating movements and reporting positions, but she could also hear return fire from what were presumably the two men who had been hunting her. "How many people are going to get hurt because of me?" Sarah asked, feeling overwhelmed with guilt. "None of this is your fault," John replied firmly. "The people responsible for this situation are the ones who decided to cover up war crimes and kill witnesses." The gunfire stopped abruptly, replaced by tense silence that was somehow more frightening than the chaos that had preceded it. Sarah could hear muffled voices and radio chatter, but she couldn't determine whether the good guys or the bad guys had won the confrontation. "Sarah Chen," a female voice called out, Rebecca's voice. "It's safe to come out." Sarah and John both stood up, and Sarah cautiously approached the ICU entrance. Rebecca was standing in the corridor wearing tactical gear and carrying a rifle, surrounded by several other similarly equipped personnel who were obviously military or intelligence operatives. "Are you hurt?" Rebecca asked as soon as she saw Sarah. "No," Sarah replied. "What happened to the two men?" "One is dead, the other is in custody," Rebecca said matter-of-factly. "But they weren't working alone. We've identified at least 4 other teams that have been deployed to eliminate potential witnesses in the Operation Nightfall case." Sarah felt her heart sink. "So this isn't over." "Not even close," Rebecca confirmed. "But it does clarify your situation. You're officially a target now, which means you can't go back to your old life under any circumstances." Sarah looked around the ICU, thinking about the 3 years she had spent working at St. Carway, Mary's Medical Center. It hadn't been the life she had originally planned, but it had been peaceful and meaningful in its own way. Now that life was gone forever, destroyed by forces beyond her control. "What are my options?" Sarah asked. "You can accept federal witness protection and testify about Operation Nightfall," Rebecca said. "Or you can accept federal protection without testifying, but that would mean spending the rest of your life in hiding under a new identity."
What's the difference? Sarah asked.
"If you testify, there's a chance that the people hunting you will face prosecution and imprisonment," Rebecca explained. "If you don't testify, they'll remain free and dangerous, which means you'll never really be safe." Sarah understood the implications. Testifying was dangerous, but it offered the possibility of ending the threat permanently. Refusing to testify meant accepting a lifetime of looking over her shoulder and wondering when the next team of killers would find her. "There's one more option," John said from his hospital bed. Both Sarah and Rebecca looked at him with surprise. "What?" Rebecca asked. "She could join us," John said, "officially, as part of the team that's working to expose Operation Nightfall and prevent Operation Blackout." Rebecca's expression became thoughtful. "That's not standard procedure." "Nothing about this situation is standard procedure," John pointed out. "She has medical training, special operations experience, and first-hand knowledge of the people we're trying to stop. She could be an asset instead of just a protected witness." Sarah stared at both of them as she processed what John was suggesting. Instead of hiding from her past or simply testifying about it, she could actively work to prevent future atrocities like Operation Nightfall. "What would that involve?" Sarah asked. working with a joint task force that's been assembled to investigate military contractors and intelligence officials who have been involved in illegal operations, Rebecca explained. You would use your medical expertise to analyze evidence and your personal knowledge to help identify other potential witnesses or sources of information. It would be dangerous, John added honestly. More dangerous than witness protection, but potentially more effective at stopping the people responsible.
Sarah thought about Major Williams, Captain Rodriguez, and Staff Sergeant Johnson, 3 good soldiers who had died because they had possessed inconvenient knowledge. She thought about the 43 civilians who had been killed during Operation Nightfall, and the hundreds more who would die during Operation Blackout if it wasn't prevented.
How much time do I have to decide? Sarah asked. You need to decide now, Rebecca said. We have intelligence suggesting that Operation Blackout is scheduled to begin within the next 72 hours. If you're going to help us stop it, we need to move immediately. Sarah looked at John, who was watching her with an expression of quiet confidence. He believed she would make the right choice, whatever that might be. She looked at Rebecca, whose professional demeanor couldn't completely hide her hope that Sarah would agree to help. Finally, Sarah thought about Dr. Elena Vasquez, the person she had been before she became Sarah Chen. Elena had been a combat medic who had dedicated her life to saving others, even when it meant putting herself in danger. She had been willing to sacrifice her career and her safety rather than participate in covering up war crimes. Sarah Chen had been a comfortable lie, a way of avoiding the difficult choices that came with having dangerous knowledge. But Elena Vasquez had been the truth, and it was time to stop running from that truth. I'll do it, Sarah said. I'll join your task force. Rebecca smiled for the first time since Sarah had met her. Good. We leave in 1 hour. 1 hour, Sarah repeated. What about John? He just had surgery. I'm coming with you, John said, already reaching for the IV line in his arm. Absolutely not, Rebecca said firmly. You're not medically cleared for field work. Then clear me, John replied, looking at Sarah. You're a doctor. Clear me for duty. Sarah looked at his chart and his current vital signs. Medically, he should remain in the hospital for at least another 48 hours. But she also knew that Navy SEALs were trained to function with injuries that would incapacitate most people. This is insane, she said. Sanity is a luxury we can't afford right now, John replied. People are going to die if we don't stop Operation Blackout. Sarah made a decision that would have horrified her just hours earlier. Against my medical advice, but considering the circumstances, I'm clearing you for limited duty. Rebecca shook her head in disapproval, but she didn't countermand Sarah's decision. Fine, but if you collapse in the field, I'm leaving you behind. Understood, John said, carefully standing up from the hospital bed. As Sarah watched John prepare to leave the hospital against medical advice, she realized that her transformation from Sarah Chen back to Dr. Elena Vasquez was already complete. She was once again making decisions that prioritized the greater good over personal safety, and once again accepting responsibility for consequences that extended far beyond her own life. The question now was whether they could stop Operation Blackout before it began, and whether they would survive the attempt. The Joint Task Force's command center was located in a nondescript office building in downtown Seattle, 3 floors below street level, in what had once been a Cold War-era fallout shelter. Sarah found herself surrounded by the most sophisticated intelligence-gathering equipment she had ever seen, operated by a team of analysts and operatives who treated the prevention of Operation Blackout as a matter of national security. Colonel Marcus Webb, the task force commander, was a career military officer whose granite expression suggested he had seen too much combat to be surprised by human cruelty. When Rebecca introduced Sarah as Dr. Elena Vasquez, his first question was direct and uncompromising. Are you prepared to testify under oath about everything you witnessed during Operation Nightfall? He asked.
Yes, Sarah replied without hesitation.
Even if it means exposing classified information that could compromise other ongoing operations? Colonel Webb continued. Sarah paused, considering the full implications of his question. If those other operations involve targeting civilians or covering up war crimes, then yes. Colonel Webb studied her for a long moment, then nodded approvingly. Good. Because what we're about to show you is going to test that commitment. He led Sarah, John, and Rebecca to a secure conference room, where the walls were covered with photographs, documents, and timeline charts that mapped out a conspiracy involving multiple government agencies and private military contractors. Operation Blackout is scheduled to begin in 18 hours. Colonel Webb announced without preamble. The target is a refugee camp in Jordan that houses approximately 800 people who fled from Syria. Sarah felt sick to her stomach.
800 civilians.
The official mission briefing describes it as a counter-terrorism operation against a high-value target who is allegedly using the refugee camp as a base of operations.
Colonel Webb continued.
But our intelligence suggests that the real purpose is to eliminate witnesses to previous operations, including Operation Nightfall. Rebecca activated a large display screen that showed satellite imagery of the refugee camp. Many of the people in this camp are survivors from the area where Operation Nightfall took place 3 years ago. They've been providing testimony to international human rights organizations about civilian casualties in that region. So the plan is to kill them all to prevent them from testifying? Sarah asked, horrified. That's our assessment, Colonel Webb confirmed. Operation Blackout would eliminate the witnesses while providing cover for what would be described as a successful counter-terrorism mission. John, who had been quietly studying the mission briefings displayed on the conference room walls, looked up with a grim expression. Who's commanding the operation? General Patricia Hawkins, Rebecca replied. The same person who was in command of Operation Nightfall 3 years ago. Sarah recognized the name. General Hawkins had been the one who had ordered her to sign the false report about Operation Nightfall, and who had threatened her with charges of treason when she refused. She's using the same playbook, Sarah realized. Create a situation that justifies eliminating inconvenient witnesses, then cover up the real purpose with a story about fighting terrorism. Exactly, Colonel Webb said. But this time, we have advance warning and the resources to stop it. How? John asked. Colonel Webb activated another screen that showed a map of the Middle East with various military bases and assets marked in different colors. We're going to expose the operation before it begins by releasing the truth about Operation Nightfall to the press, along with evidence that Operation Blackout is designed to silence witnesses rather than eliminate terrorists.
What kind of evidence? Sarah asked.
Rebecca handed her a thick folder containing what appeared to be classified documents, communications transcripts, and financial records. Everything we've gathered over the past 18 months about the conspiracy to cover up Operation Nightfall and eliminate potential witnesses. Sarah opened the folder and began reading. Her medical training helping her to quickly identify and understand the significance of various pieces of evidence.
What she found was a systematic pattern of deception, intimidation, and murder that extended far beyond anything she had imagined. This shows that Major Williams, Captain Rodriguez, and Staff Sergeant Johnson were all killed by the same assassination team, she said, looking up from the documents. The same team that was sent to eliminate you at the hospital, Rebecca confirmed. We have communications intercepts proving that their deaths were ordered by General Hawkins personally. Sarah continued reading, her sense of outrage growing with each page. These financial records show payments to private military contractors for witness elimination services. They're not even trying to hide what they're doing.
They never expected anyone to be able to gather this much evidence, Colonel Webb explained. The Operation Nightfall cover-up was supposed to be complete and permanent. John was studying a different set of documents that appeared to contain mission briefings and personnel assignments.
The team assigned to Operation Blackout includes some of the same people who participated in Operation Nightfall, which means they'll recognize the pattern, Sarah said. They'll know that they're being sent to kill civilians rather than terrorists. Some of them will, Rebecca agreed. But they'll follow orders anyway because that's what they've been trained to do. Sarah thought about the soldiers who would be participating in Operation Blackout, most of whom probably believed they were serving their country by eliminating dangerous terrorists. The reality was that they were being manipulated into committing war crimes by commanders who were more concerned with protecting their own careers than with protecting innocent lives. How do we stop it? Sarah asked. Colonel Webb consulted his watch. In exactly 4 hours, you're going to testify before a closed session of the Senate Intelligence Committee about everything you witnessed during Operation Nightfall. Your testimony will be recorded and simultaneously transmitted to major news organizations around the world.
4 hours?
Sarah repeated. Will that be enough time to stop Operation Blackout? It will have to be, Colonel Webb replied. Once your testimony becomes public, Operation Blackout will be impossible to execute without creating an international incident. General Hawkins will have no choice but to abort the mission. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. 800 lives would depend on her willingness to tell the truth about what had happened 3 years ago, regardless of the personal consequences. What about the people who have been trying to kill me? She asked. Will they still be a threat after I testify? That depends on how many of them are arrested when the conspiracy is exposed, Rebecca replied honestly. But your value as a target will decrease significantly once your testimony becomes public knowledge. Dead martyrs are more dangerous than living witnesses, John added. Once you've told your story publicly, killing you would only generate more attention and credibility for your testimony. Sarah nodded, understanding the logic but still feeling nervous about the risks involved. What do you need me to do? Tell the truth, Colonel Webb said simply. Everything you remember about Operation Nightfall, everything you were told to do afterward, and everything you've learned about the cover-up. For the next 3 hours, Sarah worked with a team of legal experts and intelligence analysts to prepare her testimony. They helped her organize her memories chronologically, identify the most important facts, and anticipate the kinds of questions she might be asked by skeptical senators who had built their careers on supporting military operations. As the time for her testimony approached, Sarah found herself thinking about the 43 people who had died during Operation Nightfall. She had tried to save them, but her medical training had been inadequate against the severity of their injuries. Now, 3 years later, she had a chance to honor their memory by preventing a much larger tragedy. Ready? Rebecca asked as they prepared to leave for the Capitol building where the Senate Intelligence Committee was waiting. Sarah took a deep breath and thought about the choice she had made 3 years earlier, when she had refused to sign the false report about Operation Nightfall. That choice had cost her career, her identity, and 3 years of her life, but it had also preserved her integrity and positioned her to prevent Operation Blackout. I'm ready, she said. The Senate hearing room was smaller than Sarah had expected, with only a handful of senators present for what was officially classified as a closed intelligence briefing. But she knew that her words were being recorded and that they would soon be heard by millions of people around the world. Dr. Vasquez, the committee chairman, began. Please state your name and qualifications for the record. Dr. Elena Vasquez, Sarah replied, speaking clearly into the microphone. Combat medic with the 75th Ranger Regiment, later attached to Special Operations Support Units in Afghanistan and Syria. For the next 2 hours, Sarah told her story in complete detail. She described the intelligence briefing that had led to Operation Nightfall, the helicopter approach to what was supposed to be a terrorist compound, and the horrifying discovery that they had attacked a refugee camp instead. She testified about her efforts to treat the wounded civilians, her refusal to sign the false report, and the threats that had driven her to disappear and assume a new identity. She described the murders of Major Williams, Captain Rodriguez, and Staff Sergeant Johnson, and the evidence linking their deaths to the Operation Nightfall cover-up. Most importantly, she explained how Operation Blackout represented an escalation of the same criminal conspiracy, designed to eliminate witnesses to previous war crimes while creating new ones. In your professional medical opinion, one senator asked, how many of the civilian casualties during Operation Nightfall could have been saved if they had received proper medical care? Sarah thought carefully about her answer. Based on the nature of their injuries and the time that elapsed before they received treatment, I estimate that 23 of the 43 victims could have survived if we had been prepared to treat civilians rather than terrorists. And in your opinion, was the attack on the refugee camp a mistake, or was it intentional? Another senator asked. The intelligence was either deliberately falsified or negligently inaccurate,